Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, July 13th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the VA is reporting record high rates for suicide risk screening and follow-up. Plus, Congress has a lot on its agenda. The harder question is whether everyone agrees on what belongs at the top of the list. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Defense Department is providing little guidance on how firms are expected to comply with a series of restrictions aimed at severing ties with companies the Pentagon says support Beijing's military. A new class deviation the department recently issued significantly broadens the definition of Chinese military company, but it's unclear how exactly it impacts defense contractors. Federal News Network's Anastasia Opus spoke with Tracy Howard, government contracts partner at Wiley Rein, to learn more.
Under the terms of the NDAA, these prohibitions took effect on June 30th, and we had been waiting for regulatory implementation to come out, and it seemed like that might not happen before June 30th, and then DoD ended up issuing this class deviation to revise the DFARS and implement the regulations. They were issued on June 29th and took effect immediately. So there was no opportunity for notice or public comment on the rules before they were announced or took effect.
Now we have these restrictions in place, but the Defense Department hasn't issued a DFARS rule telling contractors how exactly they need to comply. So Section 851 prohibits DoD from working with companies that retain lobbyists representing firms on the Pentagon's blacklist. And then we have Section 851 that prohibits DoD from contracting with companies that enter into contracts purchasing technology, goods, or services from those firms. So now Congress told DoD that the rule applies to companies on that 1260H list, the blacklist, but the class deviation seems to broaden the definition of a Chinese military company beyond that list. Could you talk about that prohibited sources list? How does it change contractors' compliance? And maybe what are some of the challenges that contractors might now face complying with the rule?
So the 1268 list has been around for several years now, and it's DoD's determination of companies that are associated with the Chinese government and the Chinese military that are operating in the United States. And I think what happened here is the rule, the DFARS class deviation, addresses multiple issues. And so there's one definition of Chinese military company, and it's used throughout that DFARS Part 240. And it goes beyond just the 1260H list. It also includes companies that are listed or non-specially designated nationals, which comes from the Department of the Treasury. It includes entities that are identified by the Commerce Department. And then we have a catch-all for any entity that's owned or controlled or affiliated with an element of the government or the military of China, or a subsidiary or affiliate of those entities. So that's a significant expansion. In terms of how this affects contractors, that's a little bit unclear, because with respect to Section 851, the representation that contractors have to make still refers elliptically back to the 1260H list only. So contractors have to represent that they do not do business with covered lobbyist, and a covered lobbyist is defined as someone who conducts lobbying activities on behalf of a company on the 1260H list. It does not appear to encompass the broader definition of Chinese military company. But again, that's a little bit of a gray area, and it's not entirely clear what the rulemakers were intending here. So most contractors that I know are approaching this by getting representations by lobbyists or other people that they do business with and asking those people or companies to certify that they are not covered lobbyists, they're not representing 1260H entities. And so on what the DoD contractor has to do is essentially the same here. Reach out, get these representations from people saying, I'm not a covered lobbyist. I think the potential for greater vetting is on the people who are being asked to make those representations. And does that go beyond just representing people on the 1260H list, or does it encompass these other categories that are in the DFARS?
We also have, the memo says that the ban does not apply to companies that made reasonable inquiries into lobbying activities. But I think neither the provision nor the class deviation actually mention anything beyond that. So what constitutes a reasonable inquiry?
That's a very good question. We don't know exactly what that means. And we have a reasonable inquiry, singular, is defined in the FAR. But this is a little bit of a different context. And so I don't think you can rely on the FAR definition here. I don't think it would make sense. Because it's not defined, it's going to be up to companies to determine what they think is reasonable. Most contractors who I've spoken to have decided that it's going to involve getting representations from people who might be covered lobbyists. It could also involve reviewing public disclosures from lobbying or the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Those could also be activities that one would consider to be reasonable inquiries. But it's not at all defined, as you said, and so the rulemakers haven't given us much to go on here.
Anything else that contractors should be aware of now that this class deviation is out?
I would say anytime contractors are making representations to the government, whether standalone or by virtue of submitting a proposal, that's creating False Claims Act risk. And we've seen a lot of emphasis over the last few years in scrutinizing contractors and the representations that they make to the government and using the False Claims Act to police that. And so this is one additional area that contractors need to be concerned about and make sure that they are complying when they are submitting their proposals and representing that they are compliant.
That's Tracy Howard, Government Contracts Partner at Wiley Ryan, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the VA is reporting record high rates for suicide risk screening and follow-up. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. After an Inspector General review identified gaps in suicide risk screening and follow-up, the VA moved to strengthen those processes across its system. The result is higher screening rates and more reliable evaluations for veterans at risk. Joining me to break down those improvements is the Acting Executive Director of the Office of Suicide Prevention at the Department of Veterans Affairs, Dr. Stephen Dobsha. Dr. Dobsha, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
There is some good news coming out of VA. They recently reported record high suicide risk screening and follow-up rates. Given all of the focus on veteran suicides, that does sound like it's great progress. What has changed operationally to make this possible?
Well, a number of things have happened over the last several years. First, preventing veteran suicide remains VA's highest clinical priority. And so our recent positive results reflect years of a sustained investment in building one of the most comprehensive suicide prevention systems in the nation. So we began implementing our new suicide risk identification strategy otherwise known as Risk ID, beginning in about 2018. And over the last 8 years, Risk ID has become really one of the nation's largest universal suicide risk screening and evaluation programs. So our success has really been driven by implementing standardized screening processes across multiple clinical settings. We've expanded staff training, we've refined that, strengthened performance monitoring, and really in an effort to ensure veterans who are identified as being at higher risk are rapidly connected to care as indicated.
These improvements come after an Office of Inspector General review that found gaps in the screening and follow-up processes. How important were those recommendations in how VA approached designing this multi-pronged outreach strategy?
They were very important. They were quite helpful to us, and we really tried to view those recommendations as an opportunity to strengthen our already robust system. So we did a number of things in response. First, suicide risk screening and evaluation training is now required for clinical staff responsible for those activities. And a lot of our training efforts have been ongoing. There are periodic updates which help. We've also established clear national performance benchmarks to ensure that people are screening and evaluating compliant with our protocols and policies. We've developed new monitoring systems to help us assess performance in particular areas such as inpatient mental health stays. And facilities have been required to develop standardized operating procedures to define staff responsibilities and workflows. So as a result, we've addressed all of those recommendations and improvements are in place across the system. And I'll just add that one of the most important lessons learned is that suicide prevention requires continuous evaluation, refinement, and accountability. And we have found it quite helpful to use data and feedback to improve our performance and ensure that veterans receive consistent and high-quality care.
Well, speaking of data, one of the headline numbers here is that 96% of at-risk veterans now receive a comprehensive evaluation within 24 hours. That's a really tight window. What has to happen on the ground to actually deliver that kind of response?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when a veteran screens positive for suicide risk, and that's a pretty limited number of questions initially, the process doesn't stop there. So that if someone has a positive screen, that immediately triggers a more comprehensive evaluation that's conducted by a qualified clinician. So in most outpatient settings, those evaluations occur the same day. In inpatient, residential, and emergency room settings, veterans receive an immediate risk assessment and appropriate intervention. And the evaluation it really helps determine the level of risk. It's really a tool for the clinician and the patient to work together to figure out what is that level of risk and what makes most sense as a next step. And that might be safety planning. It might be more direct crisis intervention, might be hospitalization in some cases, or referral to outpatient services.
What are the biggest challenges of meeting that 24-hour window? Is it availability of the folks who do the next step?
Not usually. There are usually qualified clinicians who are available. I think it does take time. As I mentioned before, we've done a lot of work to develop workflows so that we're able to find the clinicians. So in some cases, like in primary care settings, we may call in mental health specialists who are on site in those settings to come do the care. In other settings, the primary care clinician may start with that initial evaluation and then refer on as needed.
Dr. Stephen Dobshaw is the Acting Executive Director of the Office of Suicide Prevention at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Dr. Dobshaw, at the same time, the VA's data shows that many veterans who die by suicide weren't actually enrolled in VA care. How does that shape your approach to suicide prevention?
Yeah, it's had a lot of impact and increasingly a focus for our service. So one of the most important findings we have found in the last few annual suicide reports that our office puts out is that many veterans almost 2/3 who die by suicide aren't connected to VA healthcare at the time of death. And so we've made significant efforts to expand outreach beyond our facilities and into communities where veterans live and work, are looking for resources. And so during the first half of this year, VA has done a lot of work around messaging and communications. So we've delivered more than 1.4 million text messages and 11 million emails to veterans nationwide, promoting healthcare enrollment as well as suicide prevention resources. And those efforts have contributed to more than 124,000 new enrollments into VA healthcare as of June of 2026. We've also expanded partnerships with veteran service organizations. We're doing more work with faith-based organizations, community coalitions, state governments, peer networks, and local providers to reach veterans who may never walk into the doors of a VA facility.
And as you press that outreach, what are you hearing from veterans? Is this the first time they've had contact with the VA? Are they responsive and enthusiastic?
They are. There are many who are now, well, for one thing, many of the veterans we're reaching are getting enrolled in care. Now, that's a first step. Once you get enrolled, you need to make appointments and actually connect with care. So not everybody's doing that. Just the fact that at least to date, 124,000 new enrollments just this fiscal year is some evidence that people are interested in those services and would like to be engaged.
And you just also mentioned about the number of organizations that you're reaching to as well. Where has the integration across those programs been the most challenging, and where would you say it's made the biggest difference?
It might be a little early to see where some of the biggest differences are. We're working very effectively with the Governor's Challenge, 50-state challenge, and doing a lot of work around transitioning veterans who are in that first year after they leave the military. Turns out that's a very high-risk group. And so I just went to a meeting a few weeks ago where we met with representatives from 5 states to talk about their programs. The approaches are variable and involve reaching out, various efforts to reach out to veterans, different types of supports and community resources that are offered to the veterans, and so forth. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. I would say, in general, veterans in the community are very welcoming. There's a lot of people who really don't know what we do in VA. We're working very hard to get the messages out that we want to help and that we're available.
We just chatted with GAO recently about a report they did on DOD's suicide prevention training program, basically finding that the training is not standard, it's not measured, they don't have good data on how it's being completed. If DOD's program was meeting GAO standards, how would you expect that suicide prevention awareness to carry over from active duty as folks leave and actually enter veteran status?
I think it would have impacts in a number of ways. Certainly, I think military service members who leave the service would be more aware of resources available to them. I think they would all have some basic skills in recognizing warning signs among their peers, and maybe have some skills in being able to help their peers get into care. I think ideally in a program you'd see spouses and supports engaged as well. And so, within VA, we have something called SAVE training, which all veteran-facing staff participate, which touches on all those skills. Now, the majority of people that are trained in this aren't experts in suicide prevention, and so a key piece of that is knowing when to refer and how to refer and what resources are available. So I think that an optimal training program would include all of those components.
And as you look ahead at VA's suicide prevention programs, what are the next priorities for you?
Well, I think one of the things that we want to do is focus more on what's called a precision medicine approach. And that refers to making sure that you can offer the right or the best treatment at the right time for that particular person. So right now, because we know that no single intervention works for every veteran, and so we're trying to tailor our approach, learn better ways to tailor our approaches to what does a veteran need at the particular time. And so one of the ways we do that is with predictive analytics. So we are working with data available in the medical record, for example, and with veterans themselves to identify, what are key risk factors, and can we identify subgroups of people that may be at especially high risk that then we can develop programmatic changes for. So that's a big effort. It's still early phases to some extent to figure out how to best do that. So we're also working on better ways to enhance our care coordination. So helping with some of these handoffs and workflows to make them more efficient, make the communication stronger, especially with community providers between the VA and the community. We're working on these partnerships in the community. We think that suicide is everybody's business and everybody needs to help. And we're trying to develop more targeted intervention for these subpopulations that may be at especially high risk. We also have interest in strengthening protective factors for veterans. So that includes enhancing connections to care, family support, stable housing, financial well-being, helping people develop meaningful relationships and purpose.
As we close here, let me give you the opportunity for a public service announcement. What do you most want veterans and their families who might be listening now to know about VA suicide prevention programs?
I think that we're here. I think we have done a lot of work, especially in the last decade. I've been in the VA 31 years, but I've seen a lot of effort in the last 10 years to develop a real comprehensive suite of opportunities and interventions. And so I would invite people who are looking for help to reach out to us. And we also need your help. I think one of the biggest challenges, as we talked about, is reaching out to veterans who aren't connected to VHA care. And so I think things that you can do within your communities to get involved are an important piece of the picture.
Dr. Stephen Dobshaw is Acting Executive Director of the Office of Suicide Prevention at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Dr. Dobshaw, thanks so much for sharing this important work with us.
Well, you're very welcome.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the federal government spends tens of billions of dollars each year on university research. Most taxpayers never see how that system actually works. But first, Congress has a lot on its agenda. The harder question is whether everyone agrees on what belongs at the top of the list. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Congress has a full plate before lawmakers leave town for August. The problem isn't a lack of important work, it's that competing priorities from the House, Senate, and White House are all jockeying for the same limited attention and political capital. For a look at where those tensions stand, I'm joined now by Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, so great to talk to you again. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely.
Both chambers are back in town this week, but there's only 8 legislative workdays before they leave again for their 5-week recess in August. It seems like there's an awful lot on their plate, but not a lot of time here. What are you watching as the top important things they've got to get done over the next couple of weeks?
The biggest thing I'm watching is the series of defense and military spending pieces of legislation that are kind of stuck right now, and especially the National Defense Authorization Act. I mean, you would think the NDAA at this point would have moved forward more than it has, but of course, right before they left, the House had that whole car crash, if you will, politically related to the NDAA and the SAVE Act, the legislation that would require a national voter ID, and the effort by House Speaker Mike Johnson to merge those didn't go over well with the conservative wing of the party. So it's kind of surprising that the NDAA is stuck in suspended animation right now. And then you also have the $67 billion that the Pentagon wants in the supplemental for Iran. And given all the different things that are happening in connection connection with Iran. There's really a lot of nervousness and concern among lawmakers about what's going to happen with all this military spending, even though they have moved forward on the bulk of the Pentagon and White House request for over $1 trillion in defense spending. There's all these different tangents related to it, including the reconciliation bill, which is $350 billion. It just doesn't seem like all of them are coming together as they need to be, at least right now. And as you point out, with only 8 legislative days, how do you sort all this out and get it done before they go off on summer recess?
Are you seeing any move from the White House or the Pentagon to try to explain the current situation, to try to move lawmakers forward?
There have been efforts on that front. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was up here on the Hill before they took break, kind of quietly meeting with lawmakers behind the scenes, especially on the Senate side in connection with what they are going to do moving forward. And I do think that they are going to, if the lawmakers get the answers that they want from the administration, I think some of these things can move. But there's still a lot of skepticism, even among Republicans who support the president, about whether or not this money is going to get approved, because they really just don't know what's happening with Iran. And that's just a big question mark right now.
Well, and a big piece, as you said, of the Pentagon's proposed budget for 2027 sits in Reconciliation 3.0. And we've talked about that many, many times, but we've also just kind of talked about it as a big bucket of things. What else is in there that folks really have a vested interest in trying to move forward?
Well, part of it, of course, are many pieces of military equipment that they want to get through. You have $16 billion for things like the Air Force and new F-35s. You have the fact that there needs to be ramping up of munitions in connection with the war with Iran that some are concerned have dropped to a level that's too low. The Space Force is asking for $12 billion in reconciliation funds. So those are all the military parts of it. And then there are all these domestic things that there's talking about, but they haven't really actually got them physically in the legislation. On the House side, there's consistently talk about getting affordability measures put in there. Of course, the SAVE Act that I just mentioned, there's talk about somehow getting new grants that would go to states so that they could do more to verify the IDs of people when they vote. There's a whole smorgasbord of things that the House lawmakers in particular want to put in there. But on the Senate side, there's a lot of skepticism about whether or not Reconciliation 3.0 is even going to happen. Senators are skeptical that the House is, first of all, going to come through and get this approved. And then, as we heard over a month ago from Senator Mitch McConnell and Susan Collins, the Republican appropriations chief, they both are skeptical that 3.0 will actually move forward. And then on top of that, you have the complication of Senator McConnell himself, who, of course, has been in the hospital since mid-June. And people are worried about whether that will kind of slow things down in terms of the fact that he heads up the subcommittee that essentially moves forward on Pentagon money. So, again, a lot of question marks right now as we head into this week.
Mitchell Miller is Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, I'm hearing that some of the challenges with Reconciliation 3.0 might also be because folks out on the campaign trail are having trouble talking about Reconciliation 1.0, the one big, beautiful bill. What are you hearing there?
Right. I mean, there was supposed to be a very symbolic piece of legislation passed by the House before they went on break that essentially said, hey, look what we did a year ago. We pushed it through and we got the big, beautiful bill done. And since then, they've of course, renamed the legislation and say it's mainly more about working families and tax cuts. But they have had a very difficult time, Republicans, in selling the public on exactly what is in this massive bill. And as you and I have talked about before, part of the problems, and whether it's for Republicans or Democrats, when they get one of these huge bills through Congress, there are so many disparate things in connection with it that they have a hard time kind of giving a basic bullet point to the constituents. What does this mean for me? Now, Republicans have stressed the fact that people's taxes would have gone up had this not been passed. But other than that, they've really not had a lot of luck selling this. And of course, there was a lot of talk about President Trump going out on the campaign trail essentially and selling parts of affordability and issues related to how this is making people's lives better. But they've really had a difficult time getting their messaging across.
This seems like it poses some real challenges for the basic legislative agenda. And of course, one of the things we're always concerned about here is the appropriations bills. Are any of those moving underneath all of this turbulence?
Very, very slowly, kind of like a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. You have the House again was supposed to pass a State Department appropriations piece that usually would be able to get through fairly smoothly, but because everything froze in the House when they had this back and forth over the NDAA and the SAVE Act, that is stuck right now. And then on the positive side, you do have the fact that the House Appropriations Committee has actually approved all of the appropriations bills out of that panel. But on the negative side, the Senate has not considered any of the dozen appropriations bills for the upcoming year. And part of that, again, is because of the bitterness related to reconciliation. Like even, as I mentioned, Susan Collins, somebody who's right in the thick of things with appropriations, is really kind of disappointed with the fact that she thinks it's undermining the overall appropriations process. And so everything is getting stuck. And then, as we've talked about, we're getting into the campaign season, and the fact that they haven't gotten to any of the Senate appropriations bills right now, that's pretty concerning.
Well, there was a little tidbit of news on Friday that maybe gives us a flavor of how the legislative approach is going to work going forward. Both chambers finally passed the big housing bill a few weeks ago, and it got enacted in a very unusual way on Friday. What's your take on that?
My take is I have never seen anything quite like that. When you have a bipartisan bill that lawmakers from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both touted, and they were all set, of course, to sign it and have the president sign it here at the Capitol, and it didn't get signed. So then what happens is they wait for 10 days, and the president on Friday says, nope, not going to sign it. I am going to let it go. And that is because he is so upset that they have not done anything on national voter ID. So you have the very, very unusual situation of having a piece of bipartisan legislation passed by Congress, not signed by the president, not vetoed by the president, but because he didn't sign it, it passes and it now is law.
So look into your crystal ball for me and tell me what impact you think that has on the motivation to push really challenging legislation forward going, in the future.
I think that is a really, really troubling sign, because there's no doubt that the president is going to continue to put pressure on the Republican Party in the House and the Senate to try to get something related to the SAVE Act passed. And that is just really gumming up the works in connection with legislative process. The House, as I mentioned, they essentially were frozen and not able to move ahead with anything because of this the differences of opinion related to the SAVE Act. And then moving forward in the Senate, it's even more of a problem because some Republicans have also said that they're not going to go along with it. So it does not foreshadow really good things in connection with the appropriations process when you have the president refusing to sign something that Congress has passed.
That's Mitchell Miller, Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, I really appreciate your insights here, as always.
You bet.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, the federal government spends tens of billions of dollars each year on university research, and most taxpayers never see how that system actually works. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Every year, the federal government spends billions supporting research at universities across the country. That investment helps drive scientific advances, but it also depends on a complex system of funding decisions, academic institutions, and researchers. For a closer look at how that system works, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with Darren Lipome, professor of chemical engineering at the University of Rochester and author of a new book, Science Nonfiction: Behind the Scenes in University Research.
in your estimation, what made you want to take a look at the actual funding and everything else that goes along with how the federal budget impacts university research?
I've been in the academic science industrial complex, if you will, for my whole professional life and life as a student. I've been at places that are in the news, like Harvard, where I did my PhD, Stanford, where I did my postdoctoral research, and I have been a professor and a university administrator at both UC San Diego and University of Rochester. And when your field is in the news, as it tends to be these days, you want to add to the conversation. You hear a lot of things that maybe are not so correct or that are misrepresented. And what I want to do is give the public and policymakers an idea of what happens behind the curtain in university research, and maybe some antidotes to some misinformation that might be out there, and really also to expound upon the success story that is American science and innovation, and the part of the process that your audience plays a role in, which is the super important aspect of selecting and projects and administering funding.
I'm not going to ask you to open the whole curtain, because obviously we would not want you to recite your whole book. But if you could give us just a little peek behind that curtain, what actually are some of the main drivers of what gets selected, what studies get selected for funding and grants, and how does that hierarchy of what's more important, what subjects are more akin to, maybe is it for getting more attention, or is it for actually trying to make big discoveries? What's at play here?
For the last 81 years since World War II, the federal funding of U.S. basic science has been responsible for about half of all economic growth in America. And it is notoriously difficult to predict ahead of time what projects are going to lead to discoveries that transform human health, energy, the environment, information technology. But it is sort of the role of the agencies that steward public funding to identify broad areas, to develop programs to which professors such as myself and my colleagues apply for funding, and then assemble groups of experts to review those topics or to review those proposals. So the success rate in applying for federal funding is about 5 to 15%, depending on the program. And those programs range from all manner of basic science topics covered by the National Science Foundation to health and biomedical sciences covered by the National Institutes of Health, to defense technologies covered by the Department of Defense, Department of War, and their sub-agencies as well. I don't want to forget NASA and DOE as well, covering aeronautics and space as well as energy. And so what we try to do is develop a new physical or biological effect, discover a new effect that's going to hopefully in 5 to 15 years affect human life and well-being and economic health of the United States.
So $60 billion going in annual federal research funding. Let's be honest, you're a scientist, so you get this funding. All of a sudden, you turn into a money manager, and you're having to delve into the finance side of science, which may not, some scientists may not necessarily have the experience there. Where does the funding go? Say you are successful in getting that funding. How do you delegate where that money should go, whether it is towards materials, but also paying the folks who are doing the research?
That's a great question. So the median National Science Foundation grant is about $300,000 spread over 3 years. So that's easy $100K per year. And right off the top, you have to pay for the people that do the work. And so that is the stipend Sometimes there's tuition involved in the student training and the fringe benefits like the health insurance that a graduate student worker needs. So maybe that cost in total is 55,000 or so. Then you take another 15,000 for materials and supplies. Sometimes the professor who doesn't get paid for work done in the summer otherwise, because usually they're not teaching, they get a few weeks of summer salary. And then so that adds up to 70K or so. And then the remainder goes toward keeping the lights on, keeping the air conditioning and heating working, keeping the staff who do the financial administration, keeping them paid, paying for equipment in the lab that's not specific to that project, like air compressors, like minus 80-degree freezers, shared facilities. We call that indirect costs or overhead, and it's calculated on the basis of the direct costs that go to personnel, support, and materials that are specific to that project. And that's how you get 100K. There's not a lot of flexibility within that basic budget structure. Most goes toward personnel.
We're speaking with Darren Lipome. He is a professor of chemical engineering at the University of Rochester. I don't want to speak for you, but I imagine a lot of the motivation for this book came from the increased scrutiny that federal funding for research has been under over the past few decade or so. You can pick out any number of Congress persons who have been on the floor citing a study that, of course, out of context sounds like a ridiculous waste of money, but when you actually dig down into it, okay, they were actually looking for ways to lower blood pressure in humans or something like that. Do I have that correct? Have you yourself felt that scrutiny when applying for federal grants?
Sure. So science has always had its cultural adversaries. Religious objections go back to the time of Galileo and before. And then you have academic relativists who treat science as just a way of knowing. I think the scientific method is much deeper than that. It's quite dissimilar to political philosophy and religion. But what's genuinely unprecedented is that the chaos in many cases is now coming from inside the government that funds the research, and that's kind of a different category of problem. So in 2019, I received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers from the Trump White House. And that's the highest honor the federal government gives early career researchers. And the work was on biocompatible materials for implantable medical devices. And then a few years later, my work was flagged by a Senate committee as being woke or Marxist because we had language in there about involving students in research who are not, from low-income backgrounds, who are not normally involved in research, kind of widen the umbrella of the talent pool from which we can draw for science. And so this all happened under the same administration, same research, but completely the opposite treatment. And it looks less like policy and more like incoherence, frankly.
Gotcha. All right. So it wasn't involving the sexual tendencies of seahorses or anything like that. It was just a regular run-of-the-mill study that got flagged.
No, but to defend my colleagues who may work in areas that may not exactly be the sexual tendencies of seahorses, but in work that could similarly be described in kind of a comical way, you never know what's going to arise from basic research. So GLP-1 medication, CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing, this all came from stuff that you could find a line in the scientific paper or the patent that said how this work was derived, and you could always make it sound ridiculous. The issue is that we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater just because there are a few lines taken out of context from a particular grant proposal.
Gotcha. All right. So, if you were involved with the decision making from the federal side, or just, if you're a professor who's trying to get federal grant money, how do we strike that balance of ensuring that the money is being spent towards nominal research? But again, you said it's research, so you're not going to know until you try, right? So that's why it's so difficult. What measures can be put in place to maybe at least make an attempt at a balance there?
One of the major benefits of publicly funded research is that even the projects that don't work out the way the investigators believed they would are still training students, not as a byproduct, but as one of the most fruitful creators of human capital that we've devised. So that $60 billion, a good chunk of that is, at least half of that by my calculation earlier, goes toward increasing the knowledge base in the American workforce, because those PhD students, those master students in highly technical fields, oftentimes they're, like engineering research, like chemistry research, is a combination of both trades and crafts, as well as theoretical knowledge. Those people are going on and doing awesome things in U.S. industry predominantly, and also academia and policy. And even if the research aim doesn't turn into the next GLP-1 agonist drug, you still get all of that human capital on the cheap.
So give you some free PR. There is no unsuccessful experiment in your eyes.
That is true, yes.
Darren Lipomi is a professor of chemical engineering at the University of Rochester. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eric. It was a pleasure.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Secret Service has struggled in recent years with understaffing and poor workforce planning. Some of those challenges have precipitated high-profile security failures, including the 2024 assassination attempt on President Trump. Now the Secret Service is overhauling its workforce management systems as it also undertakes a major hiring push. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now with more details. Justin, thanks for being here.
Hey, Terry, good to be here.
Hey, what are we learning about how the Secret Service struggled to keep up with the pace of protective operations over the last few years?
Yeah, it's no secret that the Secret Service has been understaffed, but this DHS Inspector General report that just came out in the last couple of weeks really puts those challenges under a microscope, and specifically homes in on the years 2020 to 2024, and in the latter part of those years was, of course, a presidential election. A lot happened, the attempted assassination on then candidate Donald Trump. So it's really important to look at some of those years and see how the Secret Service has responded, because over the course of fiscal 2023 and 2024, the Secret Service was understaffed by an average of 21.4%. And so that led to some significant challenges that, a lot of folks know about today. But what the IG really found was it wasn't just the understaffing that challenged the Secret Service, but incomplete workforce data and inadequate planning that essentially led the Secret Service to assign agents to these marathon shifts with little time for rest in between, and of course contributing to burnout and exhaustion across the ranks. And the poor planning also led the Secret Service to assign unqualified personnel to protective events, and really just led to these cascading effects that, a lot of it stems from the understaffing, but there were a lot of associated issues that the Inspector General report highlighted here as well.
You mentioned that almost 21% understaffing at a time when the demand for their services was rapidly expanding. Was overtime the only method they had to make up for the fact that they didn't have enough staff?
It was certainly the primary method. The agents reported working a collective 1.192 million overtime hours in 2024 alone. There were also 1.4 million law enforcement availability pay hours, leap hours, and that's overtime too, essentially, where Secret Service agents are required to be available to work an extra 2 hours every working day in case they are needed. Secret Service personnel also lost out on $15 million in overtime earnings between 2020 and 2024 because the agency had blown past congressionally set pay caps. And so the Secret Service statutorily could not pay out that extra overtime. And so this actually exacerbated the agency's planning even further, because Secret Service agents reported that they did not put all the hours they worked into the Secret Service's system for tracking that. Their hours were changing too frequently. They didn't update their schedules in the enterprise personnel scheduling system. And that just led to these further kind of cascading effects where the Secret Service then didn't know how long these agents were working or didn't have that tracked in their systems. And so you can just kind of see this sort of circular problem that built up on itself in terms of, agents are working too long, there's incomplete data. There's this really interesting quote, that anonymous Secret Service official quote from the report, where auditors asked, why don't you have a policy for determining, how long a shift should be or the time for rest in between shifts? And the Secret Service official said, I don't think we would get anything done. We don't have enough people. And so that really underlines the problems here.
It seems like it would almost be cheaper to hire more people than to pay out all that overtime.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll talk about, but the Secret Service is certainly working on that right now.
How did these workforce challenges intersect with some of the problems that were highlighted by the July 2024 assassination attempt on then-candidate Donald Trump?
Yeah, there was a separate DHS Inspector General report on this very topic, on the assassination attempt, that came out at the same time as this understaffing report. And it's really interesting to look at the parallels here. There's some significant overlap. For instance, the IG report on the assassination attempt found that the Secret Service assigned an undertrained counter-unmanned aerial system operator to work at that Butler, Pennsylvania campaign rally where the attempt occurred. And the operator's system actually malfunctioned during the event, and partially due to their lack of training, they were unable to address the issue, and they were not able to detect a drone flight that was performed by the suspected assassin, Thomas Crooks. So you had undertrained, kind of unqualified person in that job at that event, and that's part of the problems that the understaffing led to and the poor planning led to as well. The report also found the Secret Service didn't allocate enough personnel to the campaign rally because of insufficient intelligence sharing within the agency. And that's something that the Secret Service also says it's working to shore up the intelligence sharing and the subsequent assignments that come from that intelligence sharing to different protective events going forward.
Those are some pretty significant findings. So what is the Secret Service doing to address those kinds of challenges?
So the Secret Service had pretty lengthy responses to both reports, and a lot of things have happened over the last couple of years already. One thing the Secret Service said it's done is enhanced the enterprise personnel scheduling application to ensure that it accurately records all hours worked, including overtime hours, and also ensuring that employees are paid appropriately and are not running into pay cap issues necessarily. The Secret Service has also updated staffing models using that application's data, because now they have more accurate data. They can have more accurate staffing models to plan things out for the future. Finally, the Office of Protective Operations at the Secret Service is developing a new protective resource management application, and that's a system that is going to support decision making as far as how personnel are deployed, by incorporating things like personnel availability, geographic location, and competing assignment requirements. So you can see how that system, which is supposed to come out this September, will be important for how the Secret Service plans out its deployments going forward.
But all of those systems will mean nothing if they don't have more people. So how are they coming on the hiring efforts?
Yeah, so the Secret Service set a goal last year to hire 4,000 new staff through 2028. And those plans were really bolstered by $1.2 billion that was included in the tax and reconciliation bill last year for the Secret Service. The Secret Service this year says they want to add or hire at least 2,000 new law enforcement personnel. And during an April 16th hearing, Secret Service Director Sean Curran says that they're well on their way, that they are recruiting, hiring, and training with a purpose, and using new methods like accelerated candidate hiring events to reduce the timeline it takes to hire new agents. Another thing that the Secret Service is doing is also updating its training infrastructure. Curran says that hasn't changed since he was training for the Secret Service nearly 25 years ago. And so that's something that they're really looking to do as well to help boost recruitment.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for the story.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find the full details at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.